Bonjour, bienvenue. My name is Edward Wallace. I'm the chair of the French-American Foundation USA, but I am very pleased that my colleagues from FAF Paris are with us. Amina Sabur, Lucy Topolov, Liam Sfaxi, I think Claire is somewhere here. We are just delighted for the ability to have this webinar this morning. My job is only to say hello and announce our two very distinguished participants, which is Amy Greene, Julien, Jeanneney. Both of them are distinguished professors, thinkers, and analyzers of situations. I am pleasantly surprised that we had the idea of having this webinar before we knew that there was going to be really such controversy. So this is really timely and important. I will only note that in our audience, which is, I think, almost 100 people, there are some very distinguished folks and journalists, and we welcome everyone, but we welcome them particularly. With that said, I am going to turn it over to our executive director, co-executive director in New York, Jennifer Walden-Weprin, and let her lead us into the program. Jen?
Thank you. Thanks, Ed, and welcome everyone this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are. I also want to thank you, Ed, of course, and our board of directors for your leadership, for your support, enabling us to do these programs, celebrate 250 years of friendship between France and the United States. So it's a great opportunity here today to gather us all together virtually. As we look to 2026 next year, we'll be celebrating the Foundation's 50th anniversary and America's 250th anniversary. So please continue to stay with us, connect with us, join us on all these programs. We'll be able to share and develop and grow together. With that, thank you. I'm going to introduce Margaret now, and we'll continue with the program.
Thank you, Jen. So it's our distinct honor to introduce Amy Greene, Senior Fellow, American Politics at Institut Montaigne, and Julien Jeanneney, French-American Foundation Young Leader and Professor of Public Law at the University of Strasbourg. Merci beaucoup, Amy and Julien. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much to all of you. So I will begin. And we decided that the best way to do that would be maybe to remember together a few facts since 2022 in France, since all those facts led to where we are today. First, between 2022 and 2024, in 2022, Emmanuel Macron wants to be re-elected, but he doesn't do much of a campaign. He secures his re-election, but there is a fragmented National Assembly at the end of the legislative elections with 250 presidential majority MPs, plus 62 right-wing MPs. So basically 312 center and right-wing MPs, which is more than the majority of 2089. But then Elizabeth Borne becomes a prime minister, and she has a hard time enacting a few bills, especially the pension reform bill. It enters into force, but after she used a lot of the constitutional tools in order to try to force the MPs, and the immigration bill, which is basically struck down for many of its articles by the Constitutional Council. And there is already a sense that the government has to govern maybe not against the French people, but against the members of parliament at the time. And this is one of the reasons why Emmanuel Macron seems willing to change everything after the election to the European Parliament in summer 2024, when he decides to dissolve the National Assembly. In July 2024, just before the Olympic Games, there is a snap election, and it's really bad for the parties at the center of the political spectrum. The left-wing parties, they have 193 members of parliament. The presidential parties, Ensemble, Modem, and Horizon, 166. And the extreme right parties, RN and Ciotti, 142. So if you had only 47 members of parliament from the traditional conservative party LR and 21 Lyot at basically the center right. It's a very fragmented assembly. And then it's a huge question for Macron. What will he do with that? And Macron decides during the summer 2024 to wait, to do nothing, not to appoint a new prime minister. Of course, there are the Olympic Games, and it's possible to say, let's look at the games and not at the governmental crisis. But he refuses to appoint a prime minister, saying the outgoing government is able to handle routine business, the day-to-day affairs. And then, at the end of the summer, in September, Macron appoints Michel Barnier. He comes from a very small party in parliament, LR, so the Conservative Party. And he arrives and immediately announces the government he intends to form, almost as if the National Assembly were on his side. But he is not in a position to pass a budget. And mid-December, there is a vote of no confidence and the government is brought down. Then François Bayrou arrives. He basically forces Emmanuel Macron to appoint him, saying that if he doesn't not support Macron anymore, there will be a much bigger crisis in the National Assembly. And once again, he arrives and immediately announces the government he intends to form, without taking into account the fact that it's almost impossible to do anything in this very National Assembly. September 9, as you know, very recently, the MP refused a vote of confidence to Bayrou. Bayrou has to leave. And then there is this new prime minister, someone that has been along Emmanuel Macron for a very long time. He was a minister from day one in 2017. And Le Cornu is in the position that we had 1 year ago. Basically, a new government at the end of the summer, beginning of September, with the same big question: will we be able to have a budget before the end of December? But this time, Le Cornu seems to be clever enough to wait before appointing his government. So he seems to be very low profile at the moment. And he knows that his main task is to talk with the MPs to see whether forming a governing coalition would be feasible. And the main risk would be to be brought down as soon as the left and the far right decide that it's time to do so. And it's possible that at any moment, Le Cornu could fall as well. And so the instability is very big. We don't know about the budget. We'll speak about it later. Emmanuel Macron is not in an easy position. And we don't know at the time what kind of government will Le Cornu do. So it will be with a government with, I don't know, we say a gouvernement d'experts with technicians, experts. Will it be a government with people coming from many different parties? We'll see that, but it's going to be very interesting and it's very hard, of course, for French politics. I give the floor to Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julien. So I'll take a few minutes and talk about maybe some of the political ramifications of the fact that the Bayrou government just fell, some of the public opinion issues, and maybe even open the perspective a little bit to compare with what's happening in the United States, although maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later and perhaps even do the comparison in the questions. But coming back to the French example, Julien, I think, the thing that I most took from those initial remarks is really the fragmentation of the French political ecosystem. And so you have Emmanuel Macron, who's sort of governing from a position of increasing isolation. He's surrounded by sort of an emerging sort of far left, if not to say extreme left, and emerging extreme right, neither of whom have any vested interest in finding a coalition. I know Julien will talk about some of the scenarios later, so I won't get too much into the nitty-gritty of what those cooperations might or might not look like. But in any case, you have increasing uncertainty simply because you do have these very fast emerging political forces that have no incentive to cooperate with the president, who see his political capital as crumbling, who recognize that he's an increasingly isolated president, and who are fundamentally in disagreement with Emmanuel Macron and his prime minister's perception of the debt question. It's worth mentioning that one of the reasons that the Bayrou government sort of found itself in the situation of, calling a vote of no confidence is because there was a fundamental difference in or disagreement in how some of these profound debt crises should be resolved. And indeed, François Bayrou, indicated that everybody had to contribute, make an effort in order to eliminate French debt, which is the third largest expenditure of the French annual budget currently. And two of the sort of lightning rod measures were, deleted or supprimer, sorry, I'm speaking in franglais, but is eliminating two bank holidays, two bank paid holidays, and as well as freezing some basic allocations like unemployment benefits, not having those allocations evolve to reflect inflation. So essentially, sort of the French public felt that there was this double discourse, which is to say, why should we have to make efforts, but perhaps not other segments of society? And so there is a lot of crystallization around some of the proposals coming from the left, which is introducing a wealth tax on fortunes, 100 million euros and over. So effectively, the Le Cornu government now is in this climate of uncertainty with political rivals that have absolutely no incentive or interest at this point in cutting deals with the ensemble sort of center bloc. You also have effectively an Emmanuel Macron who crystallizes a lot of disdain in the political ecosystem, and more particularly with the French public opinion. And this speaks, I think, to a much larger problem, which is a longer term issue, which will continue to face the French ecosystem, even beyond questions of the debt. How did France get here, and how does France have to get out of this? Which is really the crumbling of public trust in public and especially national institutions and politics. If you look at some of the recent public opinion polling, Sciences Po has done some. There's Savipov. You've got the IFOP, which is another very reputed public polling agency. You look at some of the data, and you look at that data over time, and you see that effectively the French public perception of the legitimacy of politicians and institutions is increasingly just sort of crumbling, and it's on a continuous downhill slope. So I just took a couple of figures to cite to you to give you a sense of the depth of this problem and the breadth of it as well. So even if 75% of French people are concerned that the debt has become a problem, a decreasing number of French citizens actually believe that they themselves should have to shoulder the efforts in order to rectify the situation. They think that there should be other places where that effort comes, whether it's taxing, mega fortunes, whether it's cutting public expenditures, but they believe that they should not be held individually responsible for getting the country out of its budgetary crisis. Only about 19% of the French public is satisfied with the action of Emmanuel Macron. The previous Prime Minister Bayrou's level of insatisfaction was an historic high of 82%. And then if you look more generally at the institutional ecosystem, about 60% of French people trust their mayor, so the closest elected official to their daily realities. Only 40% trust the national representatives in parliament. And then again, like I mentioned, less than 20% support the president. A majority of French voters believe that that there's no reason to be proud of the French political system. Less than a third say that the French democracy is functioning correctly. So you get this sense that there is a sentiment that French people are increasingly distant from the political ecosystem. Perhaps one other element that I'll evoke now, but then I'll go into some further depth a little bit later, is the notion of not only the credibility of Emmanuel Macron at home, and this sort of insidious notion that Macron himself is sort of this lightning rod for all of the ills of French politics, for some of the hard truths that maybe he's trying to tell, whether his approach is, the best or not. In any case, he really does crystallize very strong public sentiment, obviously, against him. But there's also the question of France's credibility abroad. And there is there has been, and I know that we're speaking today with people who are coming from throughout Europe, the United States, so allied countries and European partners. And there is this perception coming from outside of France as to whether or not France is actually a reliable and credible partner. And so this sort of governmental uncertainty, the volatility of the successive governments, the fact that we're now at our sixth prime minister in just 2 years, is another argument, or in any case, another point of sort of interrogation or worry for some of those French partners in terms of what France's ambitions can be at the European level, but also at the international level. And of course, we can maybe talk about that a little bit more in the questions. So I'll turn the floor back over to Julien, who I believe is going to set out some scenarios of how the Le Cornu government, I guess, might take flight or what might happen going forward.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, actually, the scenarios are we don't know yet. There is one possibility, which would be for Le Cornu to be able to build some trust between the members of parliament and to have some governing coalition, and at some point to form a government able to live before 2027, which is the next general election in France. I mean, the presidential one, and obviously the legislative one just after that. First possibility. The other possibility would be, of course, at some point for Mélenchon and Le Pen to say, okay, we have no interest in you still being the prime minister, and we want to kill your government, and we can do that like that if we decide to vote the same motion of no confidence at some point. With the help of the Socialist Party and a few members of the right-wing parties. So that's another possibility. But what will happen next? What if Le Cornu, after a few months, is one more new prime minister for only half a year after Bayrou and Barnier? At this point, it will be a bigger political crisis, and there will be one question: does Macron has to leave? And actually, a lot of people said that at the end of the summer. So many politicians actually asked for Macron to resign. Some of them asked Macron to dissolve the National Assembly. Some of them asked the members of parliament to impeach Emmanuel Macron, and all those scenarios are possible. So first scenario, if Le Cornu goes down, at some point, Emmanuel Macron feels that he's not in a position to appoint a new prime minister, that he's not in a position to appoint any prime minister, really, and that the only solution would be for him to leave. I wouldn't say that it's what we perceive of Emmanuel Macron's psychology to think like that. But we have to remember that in history, in ancient history in France, it happened twice with MacMahon and with Millerand. Two times during the Third Republic, the members of the Chambre des députés, of the lower chamber at the time, did what they called la grève des gouvernements, which is basically the fact that they voted against all the prime minister appointed by the prime minister. It was a way, twice, to make the president leave before the end of his term. And actually, if the members of the National Assembly were to agree on that, to say, okay, we want Macron to leave, I'm not sure it's the case, but if Mélenchon, Le Pen, and some of them say we want Emmanuel Macron to leave, they could say, whatever the prime minister is, we will vote motions of no confidence after motions of no confidence. And then there will be such a crisis that the only possible solution would be either for Macron to dissolve the assembly or for Macron to leave. What about a dissolution? The difficulty is the fact that if Macron were to dissolve tomorrow, we don't know obviously what would happen, but one possibility would be for the extremes to have even more members of parliament, and for the National Assembly to be even more polarized, and it wouldn't be a good thing, of course. The possibility for Macron's impeachment, la destitution, I don't think it's possible right now, because I don't think that impeachment is made under the French constitution to be used as a political tool. It's not because you don't like the politics of a French president that you use Article 68 and you impeach him. So I don't see a world in which it would be possible for the members of the Senate, 2/3 of the members of the Senate, to impeach Emmanuel Macron. So what will happen today? Of course, we don't know, but one possibility would be for Le Cornu to try something and to leave. It would be okay, one thing. The other possibility would be for Le Cornu to fall quickly before the end of December, and then we wouldn't have a budget, which would be, of course, a problem. And another possibility, if Le Cornu falls, would be for Macron either to dissolve or to leave the presidency. So a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of questions, and of course for the partners of France and the American partners of France, I see that this insecurity is something that is a real problem.
So to conclude this initial part, I'm going to focus maybe a little bit more on some of the larger questions that this current climate of uncertainty poses for France, its position perhaps within Europe, and maybe some of the domestic risks going forward, or in any case, sort of a lay of the domestic French political landscape, so internally. Effectively, what I hear when I listen to Julien is that all of the scenarios are largely imperfect, and that regardless of sort of the outcome, and regardless of whether or not the now to be named governor of the current prime minister, Sébastien Lecornu, actually lasts, this won't fundamentally resolve some of the growing fractures and divisions within the French political landscape. And so, in any case, the fundamental dynamic of a very isolated Emmanuel Macron, a highly unpopular Emmanuel Macron, doesn't disappear. Now, we have two main stakes, main electoral stakes coming up. First are the municipal elections next year in 2026, and then in 2027 are the presidential elections. So there's still enough time in the Macron administration or the Macron presidency to do things, but at the same time, political paralysis will make it increasingly difficult to imagine any sort of breakthrough legislation happening. And so effectively, where does that actually leave a president in the position of Emmanuel Macron? Oftentimes when we look at the United States, right, we see that when a president isn't doing so great at home, he tends to try to travel abroad, right? Because it's one of the spaces where the president has, significant liberty to act and position themselves a little bit sort of beyond or above the fray of domestic politics. It's not unlikely that Macron could continue to pursue such an approach. Foreign affairs in France is considered a domaine réservé, so a priority area in which the president has significant legitimacy and authority to make decisions for himself. And so it's interesting to see some of the seeds that Emmanuel Macron has been planting over the past few years on issues like European cooperation, the need for increased defense spending, the need for strategic autonomy. Those ideas are starting to take or get a foothold in Europe, especially with regards to the U.S. administration and some of the ongoing issues in Ukraine. So we see that there is, a potential foothold for Macron to really assume the mantle of a distinguished international statesman, but with the caveat of the credibility of the means. Speaking in London very recently with a number of colleagues, they were asking the question, well, are all of these announcements of increased military spending even possible? And if the government were to fall, which it since has, is it, will they actually go through? So there are a lot of questions that European partners are asking about the means that France can place to actually realize its ambitions. So the international space could be one where Macron looks to find a form, not of rehabilitation, but in any case, a margin of action much freer than that on the domestic scene. And I would say, to conclude on the internal scene, and this is really where I see a significant amount of parallels with sort of the US political ecosystem, is that there is a fundamental constraint in France, which is the ongoing rise of populism. Some of the opinion polling that I cited earlier, very clearly demonstrates, and I could have taken you over a scale of 5, 6, 7, 10 years to demonstrate the trends, but essentially what you can deduce from the sort of the dire state of trust in public institutions today and national politics is that has been an ongoing degradation. And so when you have less trust, France is also coming off of a series of very tense social moments. There was the Gilets jaunes yellow vest protests a few years back. One of the most recent points of contention was the retirement reform. There is this sentiment that French people are moving farther away from politics and that they're really questioning this sort of social contract. What should the French state provide? How much protection should the French state give? How do individual sort of ordinary citizens break out of the sentiment that economically their situation's not getting better, that politically they're not being listened to, that there's a growing distance between national representation and local citizen expectations? So all of those sort of frustrations, the degradation of trust in institutions, that's something that I've observed in my work in the United States. And over the last, 20, 30 years, it's been an ongoing phenomenon. And that really does create a very fertile zone for populist movements to take effect. And indeed, we've seen that the single most fulgurant rise in French politics over the past few years has been the extreme right. or even the extreme left to a different extent. And those are two of the political discourses that are very much capturing this sort of French political mentality, which is to say we have these solutions, but you're not going to find it in politics as usual. So, there is an ongoing concern about the forces of populism in France, and that's definitely something that's not going to be resolved over the next 2 years, and perhaps not even with the next presidential cycle. So it's not necessarily a very happy note to end on, but I think it's also important to look that in the face to better understand that it is also a phenomenon that's not going away anytime soon. So thank you so much. And I think now we have questions. I
Yes,
think there's a
absolutely.
chat.
Some of them were
We
sent
have
to
some
us
already.
before. So maybe
Yeah.
the first question, which is linked to what you just said, is the question of the end of a center. Someone asked, is it the end of center in French politics? And actually, it's a very good question because there was this myth surrounding Emmanuel Macron in 2017 that he was going to create something at the very center of French politics, taking the best people from the right, the LR and the left Parti Socialiste, and to work together, etc. I really think that this myth disappeared, and that today nobody in France considers Macron as not being in a very specific place on the French political spectrum. But the thing is, what will happen after 2027 is very important, but we don't know at all. Some people say this is the end of the bipartisan politics that we knew before, right against the left, with the polarization of the left and the right, and the center of French politics is going to stay the real place where stuff happen. And some other people, and I tend to be in this side, say, okay, we really don't know what will happen after Emmanuel Macron is going to leave the Élysée, is going to leave the presidency. What will happen after that? And depending on whether, I don't know, Edouard Philippe wins the election, or someone from the left, or someone from the extreme left or right, of course, the political effect of this event are going to be very different. And so I don't think that we know yet, but what we know, I think, is the fact that the idea of the perfect center being the best place to do politics has long gone, I think, because some people say today that it was a good thing to have right against the left, because from time to time you had alternance, you had the possibility to have a left-wing president and then a right-wing president. You would like one or not the other one, but anyway, it was possible to oppose within the circle of rationality. And some other people say that the thing with center governments, and like Macron's government, is that when you don't like it, the only way you can go to is to the extreme right or extreme left. And I think that at some point it's going to be very dangerous in France. And you spoke about the US, of course. I don't know whether it's possible to make comparisons between the two countries, but especially today. But still, I think that what we see in the US, what you said about what you saw in the US, is very concerning, because when you look at France, of course, some of the signs are the same. And at some point, the idea that someone like, I don't know, a clown like Cyril Hanouna or something could arrive and say, I want to be president. Today, we laugh about it, but in a few months, in a few years, maybe it's something that could happen. So, of course, it's very concerning.
So I see a couple of questions, both pertaining to French support for the effort in Ukraine, and some questions as to whether or not that will be called into question now that the most recent government has been toppled and a new one is not quite yet named. It doesn't seem likely that the French support for the Ukraine war effort is going to change in any significant way. Keep in mind that the current prime minister he was promoted from the Minister of Armies. He was considered to be a very good Minister of Armies, generated consensus. He had been in that post for a number of years. So he's very familiar with the stakes of diplomacy, defense, and what's happening in Ukraine as it ties to a larger question of the defense of democracy in the European space. So it's important to keep in mind that there's really no daylight between President Macron and his prime minister on the support for the war in Ukraine. Also keep in mind, and this is what I mentioned earlier about foreign affairs being, a domain reserved for the president. He has a lot of autonomy to ensure consistency in that regard. There can be one space, however, tangentially related to the war effort in Ukraine, which could be impacted by this, which was the announcement of Emmanuel Macron on July 14th in an address before the armies, calling for an increase in defense spending. And indeed, in the budget that was just sort of overturned because the prime minister was voted out, there was this notion that, or there was the reality that basically every other sector of the French economy would have to go through some form of austerity, but for the defense sector. So Emmanuel Macron, in announcing increased defense spending, suggested that everybody make an effort, whether it's individual citizens and businesses in the defense industry and other sectors, in order to contribute to that effort, in order to ensure French and European autonomy in the defense space. So obviously that budget is completely up in the air. We'll see where negotiations take it. At that time, the call for increased defense spending gained widespread support actually across the political spectrum, but it's not sure that the maintaining of the levels called for by Macron earlier this summer will hold. But I do believe that generally French support for the war effort in Ukraine will remain consistent going forward.
There is another question about constitutional reform. The question is, do you think that the Fifth Republic is on its last leg and that constitutional reform is needed? It's hard to answer this question. First, I think that when we speak about the crisis, a lot of journalists say it's a constitutional crisis, it's a regime crisis. I don't think it's the case. I think that all the tools of the Constitution of 1958 are used during this crisis. It's obviously a political crisis, but I'm not sure that the Constitution doesn't help us navigate through these moments. It's the first remark. Then, what to change in the Constitution? There is a first question, which is, are we able to change anything in the Constitution right now? It's very hard to pass a budget, to pass some statutes. I think that passing a constitutional reform is going to be very hard, especially on those on the question of basically the political life. But if it were possible, what would be a good thing? Some people say that the weight of the president is the real problem under the Fifth Republic, and that one way to resolve the thing would be to get rid of the fact that now there is a direct vote to elect the French president. But again, I think that if you ask the French people by referendum, do you want to stop electing your president? They will obviously say, no, I don't want to, because it's the only moment once every 5 years where I think that my vote really counts and that I can do something. So I'm not sure it's going to happen, even though there are some inconvenience, of course, to that. Another thing would be to try to organize some mechanisms to make it possible for people to feel that they have a voice. And one way to do that would be to change something that was created in 2008, which is called the Référendum d'initiative partagée, which is basically the possibility for the French people, a lot of them, obviously, to ask for a question to be asked by referendum to French electors. But the thing is, for the moment, they decided to put a threshold very high. So it's basically impossible for the French people, even after the Yellow Vest, even after everything, it's basically impossible for French people to force the organization of a referendum. So maybe going in that direction would be something. It wouldn't resolve everything, but it's one of the alley that we can look at, and maybe it would be something interesting. But anyway, it's not going to change anything in the last few months and the last year, in the next, few months and the next few years. And the question of the governments until 2027, and then the question of the big election everyone is looking at of 2027 is going to be a real issue, and we're not going to change the constitution before that, obviously.
I see another question asking as to whether or not France is following in the steps of the United States with the rise of political extremes, with the rise of divisive speech, and so on. My assessment of the situation is that France is by no means in a situation of polarization as advanced as the one that the United States is currently experiencing. many sort of studies, evaluations, and measurements of polarization in the U.S. would indicate that the United States is undergoing a period of particularly heightened protracted polarization, which is very, very high, even with regard to other advanced multicultural democracies in the world. So the experience of the United States in that regard is quite unique. Of course, the political system is also structured differently with the two parties, with maybe less space made available for the expression of divergent points of view through the bias of another party. And of course, in France, we have more than 20 political parties. So that sort of variety of political expression has outlets maybe that don't exist the same way in the United States. But because of the fact that that France is not in such a polarized situation, that means a couple of things. First of all, when you do look at the United States, and I've been measured some of this, written about some of this, there is an increasing notion that a majority of Americans actually believe that there is no longer a shared truth. Individuals believe that they are capable of discerning fact from fiction, but they're not so certain that their neighbor is able to do the same. We have public opinion polling, which measures that, neither Democrats nor Republicans would feel comfortable with one of their children marrying someone of the opposite party. And you can look at some of what's been happening over the last week or so, almost 10 days in the US on issues of political violence. And we can see that there's an increasing level of acceptance for violence, like a violent political gesture in politics in the United States that is perhaps, still obviously very much in the minority, but those are significant minorities and increasing minority statistics. So the United States really is in this period of particularly intense polarization. In France, a lot of the reactions to that increase in political violence in the United States have been bewilderment, outrage, condemnation, questioning. There is sometimes the sense here in France that whatever happens in the US ends up coming to France a couple of years down the road, whether it's 5 years or 7 years. So there is also the perception that there is some fragmentation, there is polarization, and there is, in some instances, sort of the notion that you have, and this sort of fuels populism, of maybe a national or global sort of mobile elite, and then individuals who stay closer to home. And you sometimes have that rural urban divide. But nonetheless, it's much less pronounced here in France than it would be in the United States. Nonetheless, there are some trends that are similar that are starting to pop up here a bit. Obviously, polarized speech on social media is one of those things. Again, the increasing sort of polarity of the French political ecosystem. Despite the diversity, we do see that there are two sort of extreme blocks emerging in the ashes of, I guess, what used to be sort of the Republican left, the Republican right, and the center. So there is the phenomenon that is taking root to some extent here, but I would say that it's far from as advanced. There's maybe one last element as well that comes into play, which is a very different notion of freedom of speech. And I say that because there is a link between what is accepted on social media and what is also considered to be civil and decent, also legal speech here in France. And, in the US, we have a more sort of liberal notion of the freedom of speech. We tend not to prohibit speech. We generally tend to punish it after it's happened if it's found to be illegal. Whereas in France, there's a much different conception of freedom of speech, which is much more heavily regulated. So what can and cannot constitute a breach of that is more specific than it would be in the US. And so, we do also have that sort of lock on the public debate, which is becoming more virulent, vehement, aggressive, hostile, if you will. But nonetheless, you find that some of those markers, like the linguistic markers and the way that political adversaries treat one another, the way individuals see their neighbors or people who are opposed to their points of view, are nowhere near as acrimonious as you might imagine them to be in the US.
So there is another question. What does the constant change in government mean for the transatlantic relations? It's a good question. I really don't know, since the fact that we change the government, it doesn't change a lot. I think in maybe in the diplomatic relations, it could change something. But for the moment, we have a hard time with the American ambassador in France. We had this summer, and so there was an exchange of letters between the Minister for Foreign Affairs in France and this ambassador, who basically said to France, "You're doing all wrong," and so there was a little crisis on that, but it doesn't have anything to do with the changing of our prime ministers. So obviously, the relations between Donald Trump's administration and European countries, and especially between Trump's administration and France, are not easy ones. But I'm not sure the crisis in political life is something that is at the very center of those relations.
I'd like to add a point to that question. I was actually reading from a different document, so I just realized now that there are actually questions in the chat. So I'm happy to discover these questions. And I just wanted to add an element of response to that particular question. Talking with leaders in business, entrepreneurs, startups from different sectors, I really do get the very palpable sense from both sides that this sort of double dose of uncertainty is a very uncomfortable place for a lot of people to be, particularly those that have business interests in the transatlantic space. When I talk on the French side, and I'm often asked sort of like what's underlying this sort of tariff policy, what's continuity, what's change, where's this all going to shake out, when will we have firm deals, like all of those questions, how can we anticipate going forward so we can start to plan, new investments or on the contrary, maybe slower investments. It's really hard to find that sort of that middle ground and the notion of where that's going to shake out. And when I speak with Americans, especially over the last few weeks, and even actually Europeans, they look with a bit of concern in France, and they sort of wonder what this political instability is going to mean. And really the question of, is France going to be able to tell itself the truth about the debt and find a way out of it, is something that's very, very concerning. And so effectively, you have the political relations, and then you also have the business relations. And I don't necessarily have the perfect answer to give you, but I do understand, and I've been hearing this, that the double dose of uncertainty makes it particularly uncomfortable, especially for strategic planning, investment planning, for a period of years to come.
There was another question about extremism in France. Where is it? Actually, it's hard to say. Of course, we can feel that the distrust in public life is going to help the National Front, the National Rassemblement National, the extreme right party. What will happen in the next legislative elections or presidential election, we don't know, of course. What we can feel is the fact that in the last advanced snap elections during the beginning of the summer 2024, one of the thing was the fact that basically the French electors decided that Jordan Bardella, who is one of the leaders of this extreme right party, shouldn't become a prime minister. And that one of the things that was said is basically, we want a lot of members of this party to be in the parliament, but we don't want them to rule for the moment. There was this idea of what we call a Front Républicain, this opposition against the Rassemblement National, which was very strong at the time. So maybe it will disappear before 2027, and a lot of people are saying this was the last time. Maybe next time they are going to vote for people from Rassemblement National. And of course, the question of Marine Le Pen being able or not to be the candidate for this party in the presidential election is going to be a big question, especially since Jordan Bardella doesn't have the same age, the same experience, and but what about extremism? I wouldn't say that the political crisis is going to grow French extremism, but maybe it's a sign of the distrust, and maybe a sign that extremism is right here, and a lot of people actually don't care about politics anymore. A lot of people actually don't look at all those prime ministers getting up, getting down, and I think that this is very troubling, because what you said, Amy, about the fact that we don't share the same trust, the same truth, actually, and everything, it's something that we can feel in France as well.
Let's see. There's a question, what are the demands from the protesters? So maybe briefly on that, and I'll maybe talk about one particular sort of element that's really particularly crystallizing the public debate. Um, you had pretty much like really, really large swaths of French society on the streets yesterday. There was a massive protest in Paris. There were big protests all throughout major cities and smaller towns in France yesterday. And you had, and we were talking a little bit before this call, and you had people from healthcare, education, the hospital system, out on the streets. You had labor unions really behind the sort of mobilizing factor or the mobilization yesterday. Just a week ago, actually, there was a movement which was much more sort of bare bones called Block Everything. And that wasn't really union sponsored. It wasn't sort of professionally organized in a structured way. It was a much smaller event. But yesterday, there really was a very large turnout. And so effectively, what's I think really interesting about the protests is that there's sort of, and I think it relates a little bit to the question of how did the debt get so big? French people are very much aware that there's a debt problem. And in fact, I don't know if you could credit Francois Bayrou with really shaking the country into sort of the shock about it. But, debt has been sort of his political like battle for a pretty long time. But yeah, more than three-fourths, like more than 75% of French people are very much aware and are actually consider themselves concerned about the debt. But at the same time, what's interesting is, public spending hasn't ceased to increase over the last 50 years. I think that the last time France had a balanced budget, if I read correctly, it was about 50 years ago. Um, France spends quite a bit, and the social protection system and the sort of état-providence, the welfare state, if you call it that, is sizable. The French healthcare system is a universal option, which costs quite a bit of money. The French public education system also costs a lot. Those are things that French people are actually really proud of. They're things that French people don't want to renounce and that they benefit from every day. But nonetheless, there is the sense that, and I think this is where some of the distance from between citizens and political institutions comes. People really feel like they're paying into a system, but they're not necessarily getting a lot out of it. So of course they're, benefiting from, excellent health insurance coverage and so on. But there is a sentiment that sort of society is stagnating. And there really is a form of crystallization in the question of socioeconomic inequality. That's also something we see significantly in the US as one element of the sort of motor of political fragmentation and suffering, if you will. And here you do also have this sort of sense that there's a growing divide between those who have the sort of famous 1% and everybody else. And so there is this question of one of the demands of sort of rethinking the social contract. One of the problems is if you don't necessarily, I guess it's mathematic, if you don't renounce enough or cut spending enough, you can't necessarily pay for everything. And France is also in a demographic crisis. So there's a large generation of older French people, but there isn't necessarily enough young people entering the workforce, to finance that, that pyramid model. One of the elements, sort of looping back quickly to the socioeconomic inequality component, that's been gaining a lot of media attention, and I've seen some reporting in English-speaking media, is the so-called Zuckman tax. There's a French economist at Berkeley called Gabriel Zuckman who proposed a 2% wealth tax, like I think I mentioned earlier, on those fortunes of 100 million euros or more. The 2%, I guess, was calculated so that those individuals pay proportionally as much tax as someone in upper management elsewhere, so on the French, economic scale. And you have actually a significant amount of support that started to come along for that measure. I did read a public opinion poll taken, I think, about 5 or 6 days ago, that showed that actually vast majorities of French voters who identify with the different political parties all support that measure. And to varying degrees, I think the center-right Republicans Party supports it the less, but still there are majority numbers of voters who support it. So that's one of the models that's been being pushed for. The socialists are very, very intent on having some type of wealth tax be implemented. The government has been pushing back. There have been arguments about, some of the problems of that, the question of the actual liquidity of and where the wealth is tied up for those individuals in question. There are other economic arguments as to why it might not be as attractive as it sounds on paper, but that's one of the elements of the public debate right now that's really crystallized a lot of attention and is seen in some ways by some voters as a litmus test as to whether or not Macron and his government really hear what the people want and are willing to make concessions to move in that direction even a little bit. I'll just end there. Francois Hollande, former president of France, who's now a legislator, has called for even the possibility of accepting a wealth tax, but even less, just as a way to, end the blockage. So that's one element I wanted to introduce.
Thank you, Amy. There is another question. How does the current political developments will affect the French government's ability to manage its fiscal policies? It's a good one because there are two ways you can answer this question. First, by looking at the political situation, and of course, obviously, you can see that for the moment, maybe Le Cornu will do something about it, but it's quite impossible to find a common place between all the political groups in the parliament to be able to accept a common budget. So of course there is this political question, but there is a legal question as well, which is does the constitution enable a government to force the members of parliament into a budget when we really need one? And the answer is partly yes. I mean that if at some point, because the question was asked 1 year ago, if at some point I don't know, in October, November, we felt that we are not going to have a budget in December, then the risk is not a shutdown like in the US. You have to repeat the fact that in France, we have ways to keep the state working after that in January. Actually, it's exactly what happened in January 2025. We had this system where basically you use the previous year's bill for finance and you apply it to the next year. So basically you cannot change anything. So for the political reforms, it's catastrophic. But for the state to be able to pay the civil servants and for the taxes and everything, it can still work. So especially for the investors, because the question was asked a lot 1 year ago, what will happen if we have no budget? If we don't have a budget in December, we'll still have a budget, but it will be the same budget and not a very interesting one.
Thank you, Julien. Let's see, looking through the questions, I see a most recent question: is France and more broadly the EU losing their places as a major geopolitical player? Are they being replaced by a new world order where the EU is on the back seat? That's a fantastic and also very loaded question. This also ties, I think, maybe into another question we saw about France's ranking in Europe. France has been a motor of Europe. France is the de facto leader of the coalition of the willing, or one of them, I should say, around Ukraine. So France hasn't hesitated to try to really carve out this, France under Macron, a pro-European position, inciting, exhorting, encouraging Europeans to do more together. France has a lot of ambition. It doesn't necessarily have the means. I was speaking to someone in London recently, and they said, as always, France has the right answer, but are they asking the right questions? And I thought that was a very funny and very British thing to say. But to get more specifically to that last question, I think really Europe, maybe not so much France, but Europe is really at an inflection point. You're right to mention that geopolitical dynamics are changing very quickly. You have a US administration which has, a very necessary focus for it on its competition with China, more of an interest in orienting its military defense, security apparatus architecture to that space, and perhaps taking less of an active interest in what's happening in European affairs. And, Europe basically constructed itself on the power of the normative sort of international order following World War II, right? And it had the ability, because it had its security guarantees, to organize itself differently, to not have to worry about that, and to really conceive of itself as an economic power, right? And the question to be asked now is the European Union or the EU plus, is it willing to imagine itself as a different kind of power? I don't know if it should or if it can, or I don't have the answers necessarily to those questions. But those are really deep existential, I think, questions for what Europe wants to be. And then there are broader questions. Who makes those decisions? What are the institutions or mechanisms to decide? Certainly, you know, one of the main priorities of Emmanuel Macron has been inviting Europe to meet the moment, recognize that there's a threat to Europe on its soil, and that the only way for Europe to sort of defend itself in a world where dynamics are changing and where the sort of, we're not quite in the new order yet, right? But we're not exactly in the old one either. So waiting for those dynamics to shake out, the best way that Europe can ensure its power is by ensuring its autonomy and independence, right? So, but those are very big questions, and there are decision-making mechanisms at the European level that need to be maybe adjusted or decided or reaffirmed. So, you know, I would say that the EU is no longer the sort of source of opportunity or solution for every country in the world, but that's not to say that Europe isn't a power and isn't important. But there is really, you know, I would argue a need for Europe to sort of look at what it wants its power to be, what are its levers or its leverage, and does it want to use that, and in what situation, and with what decision-making architecture.
Boy, this is Ed Wallace. I think we are at the end of the session. There is much more to discuss, so I hope we can continue this dialogue. I will just close by saying I had the privilege of meeting Monsieur Macron when he was a candidate at one of our New York breakfasts. My reaction as an American was he's too smart to be elected in the United States. But he was impressive. The importance to Americans that he stopped the sort of slide farther away from the center when he was elected was real. The attention here was greater than I've seen for a French election in the United States. Today, I think we hope that our friend and ally of 250 years will at least stay strong internationally with respect to Russia, China, with respect to other international issues. So I really thank you both. Merci, Amy. Merci, Julien. I want to say thank you again to the all of our friends in France, and particularly to my colleague, Jacques Aschenbruch, who is the chair on FAF France. To everybody in the audience, come back again. We'll do it again. We are excited to have this kind of conversation. Maybe one day we'll do it en français. But it is very important that we understand each other, that we communicate, and that we kind of hold up the values that have kept our friendship and bond so strong for so long. Again, merci, merci, et au revoir.
Merci. Au revoir.
Merci à tous. Au revoir.
Ou à bientôt.
Merci. À bientôt. Et bon week-end.
Et bon week-end. Absolument. Okay.